Of these mass demonstrations across Australia, of course, under the banner of Black Lives Matter, and some protesting against Indigenous deaths in custody. The federal Indigenous Minister, Ken Wyatt, now says he wants to set more ambitious targets to reduce the number of Aboriginal Australians in jail. Under the Closing the Gap program, each year targets are set. As I said in my editorial, Minister Wyatt now says the old target isn't good enough. And when state and territory leaders meet in early July, he wants it increased. Well, joining me now is someone who's been very vocal on the issue of reducing crime and violence in Indigenous communities. That's Alice Springs Councillor and Indigenous Research Director at the Centre for Independent Studies, Jacinta. Joining me now from Central Australia. Alice Springs, I think you are tonight. Great to have you on the show, Jacinta. I've got to ask you, Ken Wyatt says he wants to see less Indigenous or fewer Indigenous people in jail. Now, it's true at the top of my show I talked about the increase in the number of Indigenous people in the system. But if jail or prison time is a response to a crime, well, surely we don't want people let off a custodial sentence, particularly if it's a crime that warrants a custodial sentence just because of their race. Shouldn't we be arguing for less crimes committed rather than just not as many Indigenous people in jail?
Exactly. You know, I don't believe that it is the government's responsibility to expect to lower the rates of incarceration. This comes down to individual responsibility. And, you know, as I continue to tell the world, almost 70% of Aboriginal people incarcerated, both men and women, are incarcerated for acts of violence. And acts intended to cause injury, mostly to their own loved ones. Now, for Aboriginal women, this is often a result of being victims of domestic violence themselves and finally retaliating against their partners for it, which leads them to their criminal convictions. And what I don't see, again, in this conversation coming from the government and from leaders of Indigenous organisations is the fact that we need to reduce family and domestic violence as the number one cause for incarceration. And of course, if we've got safe homes, then our children are less likely to end up on the path to incarceration. I don't understand why this doesn't just become common sense to our leaders and to leaders of Indigenous organisations who use issues like this to demand more funds.
I've got to ask you about the increase in the prison population, 19% in the year 2000 to nearly 30% in March earlier this year. This is for Aboriginal Australians. Do you have any sense as to why there's been such an increase? Is it because we've gone now out and we've been just as tough, and certainly in some Indigenous communities, on issues like domestic violence, where perhaps in the past we turned a bit of a blind eye, all of us turned a blind eye? Or is there some other reason? Is it state-specific? You know, I know you've argued that there's got to be a lot of change, particularly in relation to women and children. Do you want to throw a guess as to why we've got those sorts of numbers?
Well, look, I couldn't tell you exactly why we've got those sorts of numbers, but I can tell you that it's not a result of systemic racism. And certainly because of the Royal Commission into Black deaths in custody, there certainly was a tendency for courts to be more lenient toward Indigenous offenders because of that very fact. You know, I'm at this stage not aware as to why there is that increase there, but it's certainly something that I will be looking into.
Yeah. Look, the weekend's protests, yes, they were in relation to Black Lives Matter, but of course in Australia they were more badged to be about Aboriginal deaths in custody. But if you look at the statistics, their ABS and criminology statistics, two branches of statistics, Aboriginal deaths in custody have actually fallen as a percentage of Aboriginal prison population numbers. They've not increased. That's the perception of the rallies, but they haven't increased. And indeed, they're now lower than deaths in custody for the non-Indigenous prison population. What do you make of then the misinformation, if I can be kind, put out there on the weekend to Australians, but it's gone all around the world?
It's all a result of identity politics. And, there are people out there who are hell-bent on creating division within our country. They will take a statistic and use it for their cause and to push that cause, nothing more. I mean, if we're going to be serious, again, I argue, if we're going to be serious about Black lives and the whole Black Lives Matter movement, well, then we should be focused on often the victims of criminals. So between 2014 and 2018, the leading cause of death for Aboriginal children was suicide. And we know that Indigenous children suffer the highest rates of neglect and child sexual abuse. But protesters are more concerned about the welfare of the individuals that would act out these heinous crimes than the very stark reality that our children are taking their lives because they are often fallen victim to these sorts of individuals. We need to turn our priorities around.
That is a very potent point. Your point, and I'll underscore that. The suicide rates, the abuse of children, of women, the perpetrators were the focus of the rallies on the weekend, those in prison, and not the victims. I've got to ask you, there's often a disconnect between Sydney and Melbourne and Aboriginal communities around the country. What's been the reaction in Alice Springs to the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, but these rallies and protests over the weekend? What's been the real world's reaction, can I say?
Well, unfortunately, there was a death in my family, and my nephew was murdered by other Aboriginal people. This is the reality of the situation that goes on.
I'm so sorry.
Because of a long-standing feud, and these deaths occur more often than deaths in custody occur. However, the unfortunate thing about Alice Springs is there is a particular group of individuals here who prefer to go ahead and create protests with regard to the rest of the country. They follow the mob mentality and they don't show the same sort of concern for the ongoing deaths outside of custody. I could take people on a tour around the town of Alice Springs and point out places where my very own family members have been murdered. But this is not the priority for those that hold protests in this town.
I am so sorry to hear that. I'm really saddened to hear that tonight. That's the first I've heard. Thank you for coming on the show. You didn't need to come on the show. I know how much you care about this topic. I'm going to take you up, and take some cameras out there with the permission of everyone that needs to give permission, for you and I to come and show Australia some of the conditions that people in places like Alice Springs, I've had the luxury of working for a senior politician, so I've been to many of these communities. You live in these communities. Let's show Australia exactly the other side to the story. We only saw one side on Saturday. Let's show them the other side.